writing alter ego, much like Clark Kent and Superman, has a day job as well. I'm a teacher, as Aditi so eloquently put, and unlike Superman, my teaching job puts me in contact with lots of immune systems that are still developing, and I am now currently getting over bronchitis. So, if I start hacking up along, I apologize profusely. So my second condition is part request and part disclaimer. One of the best ways to start a conversation is by sharing a personal story, and there will be many of those tonight, I'm sure, from me, and fingers crossed from you. But being that they are my stories, that also means that my opinion is formed through them. And my opinions aren't absolute. And that sounds silly and kind of super obvious, but I am presenting my opinions to start the conversation. So they might be incorrect, and they are certainly not fully formed, but perhaps this conversation is one you've had before with loved ones, or thought about yourself. Perhaps it's one you've never considered before. I would really, really like it to challenge you, and I hope it does. If you disagree with me, I want to hear it more than if you do agree with me. So like I said, let's start the conversation. So, as has been mentioned, I'm an author. A new one, a writer who still needs more experience, and a speaker who hopes not to disappoint you tonight, but an author nonetheless. I'm also Indian American. So both have been journeys. One, a figurative trip through writing a book, and the second, a literal transition from one continent to another. And like any good story, we need to start at the beginning. So this is my opening scene. I am what FOBs, or fresh off the boat Indians, call an ABCD, or an American born, confused they see. Both of those terms are ones I don't necessarily agree with, but we can get to that later. The truth is, I was born in New Delhi. My dad began his PhD at Penn State before saving enough money to bring my mom and 18-month-old me over from India. He was offered a position immediately after, and he stayed on as tenured faculty in State College. Now, outside of Penn State football and the fact that Vanderbilt's former head coach is now our current head coach, Coach Franklin, let me tell you a little bit about State College. It's a sweet, small, and primarily white college town in the middle of nowhere. As Jon Stewart so aptly described, you're driving along with nothing, and then it's like cow, 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 20,000 hot chicks. That's Penn State. Not sure about the hot chicks part, but most of the diversity in the area is university affiliated. For example, when my family still lived in an apartment when I was younger, I attended an elementary school whose population counted Caucasians in the minority. We were all children of international faculty and graduate students who lived in the surrounding area. Then, my family moved across town, and we lived in a full-fledged house. With that, there was a demographic change, and with that came big changes in my life. International nights at school went from being big events with hundreds of cultures showcased to nights where we were one in a handful. My graduating class from high school, the only high school in State College, was about 570. 5 others were South Asians like me. There is a very, very interesting dynamic that comes with growing up in a small town that has a limited Indian population. The India that we were taught about and grew up with is a frozen capture of the late 1980s, where Hollywood movies were just becoming big, kisses weren't shown on the big screen, and Amitabh Bachchan and Ray Fling was still fresh on everybody's mind. When our parents discuss how things are in India, despite visits every single year, it's the India that they grew up with, and one that was a world away from the United States. It's the one where arranged marriages weren't uncommon. It's the one where our family members still helped each other out. And it's the one where honor, duty, dharma, and parents were critical to everything in life, where boys and girls had gender roles and America was still a distant dream. While we've grown exponentially in the last 25 years, the State College Indian community is still like its own bubble. Unlike Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, our neighbors both the West and East, our exposure to India was really limited this time. We only have one Indian store in the entire town. Our sequestered community led my family and I to live a pretty conservative life. We're kind of caught in time. Most of our knowledge of current issues 20-somethings were facing came from being exposed to college students. My dad is far more on trend than I would ever give him credit for because he's watched and he's learned from all the students that he's been teaching. On the other side of the world, hidden away from all the traditional background we grew up with here, many of us were raised with, was the India that was growing beyond comprehension. Now, before you think that you're about to get a lecture on how kids are so different these days and they all think so differently, remember one thing. I am 28 years old. I'm not that old. I am most likely, in most cases, other than Aditya, 10 years older than you, or maybe even less. Sorry, buddy. But the internet only hit the big time about 15 years ago. So that brought so much connectivity to the world. And I remember when phone charges drastically dropped, and Skype blew up, lending a hand to the already growing spectacular collision of Western and Eastern cultures. My family in India, who had to run to the corner store to make a phone call to us, suddenly had Wi-Fi, and they were asking us if we had the latest cell phones. And the kids that were my age that were growing up in India were getting a glimpse on the television of how the kids were here, often mistakenly assuming that we were wild partiers with no knowledge about temples or garbas or religion. And here we were trying to keep up with our parents' idea of what their India was like without any clue about how it was actually growing forward. So now comes the second part of the story, the crisis. In many of our cases, let's just call it the identity crisis. There's a book called Born Confused by Tanuja Desai Haidier. In high school, when I was feeling particularly angsty and teenagerish, I clutched that thing like a lifeline. It follows the story of Dimple Lala, a girl who thinks that her Indian background is full of strangeness until she meets an Indian DJ who convinces her otherwise. It's full of everything that the American side of me loved. A little rebellion, stories about big cities and adventures in them, secret crushes, dancing, and wild nights. While the Indian side of me loved the Bollywood-esque love story and the references to pujas, mukwas, and laddus, things I couldn't connect with immediately and that felt like home. The drama in the book, in fact, it's the first young adult book with a South Asian protagonist, paralleled what was already going on in my head, that I was an Indian with no idea who I was or how I was supposed to reconcile these two different sides of me. It didn't make any sense, and literature quickly became a way to quickly bind all of these conflicting emotions. Now, I'm a teacher who has worked with teenagers before, and nothing is as raw or as honest as somebody between the ears of 13 and 18. However, one thing is abundantly clear. As a teen, you often have no idea what you're doing, and many times when you think you do, you're probably wrong. I always thought being Indian meant that I couldn't do what was fun or what was cool. The concept of being Indian and being American sounded so mutually exclusive that I couldn't possibly be both, and one couldn't possibly be related to the other. They clashed when I liked boys, and it didn't help that I had a type, blonde and blue-eyed. It didn't help when I had to choose a major. My parents had enough foresight to know that writing was where I was happy, even when I was younger, and they suggested journalism, which was an incredibly open-minded and genuine recommendation. But when every one of my Indian friends majored in sciences, I felt the pressure to measure up. So once again, Indian won out. I walked across the stage 5 years later with 2 majors and 2 minors all in sciences. Things I loved, but not topics that came naturally, if that makes any sense. On a side note, I'm lucky that my parents have gracefully sidestepped their right to give me a very, very loud "I told you so." And because when I proclaimed 7 years later that I was writing a book, fulfilling their prophecy that I'd end up doing something creative instead of something scientific, I got an "I told you so, it's about time." And when I speak about my experiences wondering which background I go with when making major life choices, every one of my Indian American friends has said the same thing. I went through it too. Our South Asian roots influence every choice that we make, each one seemingly bigger than the last one that we made. Where to go for college, because we don't want to be too far from family or people we know, and we need to go somewhere that people have heard of. What to major in, because sciences, business, engineering, or law are respectable, but as the mom in Bend It Like Beckham succinctly summarized about fashion designing, look at your cousin married to a white boy with blue hair wearing small, small things. Who to marry? Do we want arranged marriages, love marriages? Do we want semi-arranged, white partners, brown partners, any other color? Should we get married in India? Should we choose Americanized names for our children? There are a million questions I've missed, and that's just the major life choices. That doesn't even cover the smaller decisions and the superstitions that some of us follow. Someone else think twice before you pass the salt directly into someone else's hand, or cutting nails on certain days of the week. Yeah, see, people are laughing at me, it's true. All of those tiny glimmers of thought that pass through our minds are tinged with orange, white, and green, and it bleeds through our very red, white, and blue lives when we don't realize it. Tradition. The word is laced with imagery of Gandhi, Satyagraha, success, business acumen, the Ambanis, advances in all forms of technology, respect for your elders, the Mahabharata, the Taj Mahal, the Ramayana, temples, religion is existing in cities peacefully, Buddha, and so many other things. So why is it that when that imagery comes up, it often feels like we're shackled by chains? Part of this comes from the sociological concept of collectivistic versus individualistic cultures. Collectivistic cultures view an individual as part of a whole. A person is seen as an interdependent entity, part of a large social network that's bigger than them. Whereas individualistic cultures value the solitary person and their independence and their autonomy. In the late 1980s and 1990s, man named Triandis, performed a number of studies looking at the influences of these two types of society on a ton of different psychological factors. An interesting point was brought up in one of these papers by Triandis in 1988. Those from individualistic cultures who are placed in collectivistic societies feel ambivalence and even bitterness when accepting the norms of their surroundings. They tend to comply because of peer pressure, but they are more likely to push back. In the reverse situation, when someone is raised in a collectivistic society or allocentric society is placed in an individualistic setting, they experience concern about the community, while individualistic people are completely comfortable doing their own thing. Marcus and Kitayama reported in 1991 that Americans are more likely to report ego-focused negative emotions that affirm one as an autonomous entity. Non-Westerners are more likely to experience emotions related to promoting social harmony. Their emotions are bound by words like indebtedness, connections, familiarity. Collectivistic societies are also bound more by words like shame and social obligation. Does that sound familiar to you? Because it sure does to me. Now keep in mind, as I mentioned about connectivity earlier, more recent studies are indicating that culture is becoming a more hazier construct anyway. It's really becoming difficult to predict how people are going to react in these different kinds of cultures. For the sake of this speech, let's roll with it. Based on the information I just gave you, stands to reason that much of the cultural conflict between tradition and modernity can be attributed to being from a collectivistic society. And we were raised in an individualistic one. Of course, it becomes a lot more complicated once we factor in wealth, which can often create a shift from collectivistic to individualistic because of the financial interests that are involved. Gender roles, because women are often looked at differently, family to family, caste to caste, and different aspects of different communities. And between a vast array of other compounding factors, everything becomes a lot hazier. However, at the end of the day, if someone raised with values from a society where the whole group is always considered for big choices under the veil of tradition, is then placed in a society that encourages you to pursue your dreams and not follow the crowd, it's no wonder that the result is an identity crisis. So that brings us to tension. Indian, American, Desi, NRI, FOB, ABCD. I think our terminology is often indicative of how we view both America and India. As my book, The Rearranged Life, illustrates, these differences and realizations often come through one kind of story, a love story, or a failed attempt at one. A somewhat personal anecdote is as follows. I was talking to a guy last year that my parents wanted to set me up with, and he'd come to the United States about 7 years ago. When I said something offhand about Indian girls, he interrupted me and he said, "Annika, you aren't Indian, you're Indian American." "But I was born in India," I replied. "I'm as Indian as anyone." "No, you grew up here. You're not Indian, you're American," he said firmly. Fair enough. I figured he was right. I did grow up here. Then I talked to another guy very recently. He found out that I'm not only a South Indian, Brahmin, vegetarian who has never had a drink in her life, speaks Telugu, understands and speaks Hindi, did her Arangam and Bharatanatyam, and can recite Vedas alongside priests at the temple. And he said, "Oh, I must be too Americanized for you then." I thought I just figured this out. I thought that I was Indian American. And as the main character in my book says, the hyphen allows me to be both. I get the best of both worlds, right? So naturally, I assumed that that meant I got to be both traditional and modern. Here I was thinking idiotically that I had figured it out. But what does Americanized really mean? And what does Indianized really mean? I had a really interesting conversation the other night with my friend Ravi, who I met during my undergrad at Penn State. He was a fellow freshman who had come directly from India for his degree. Because of his insight about this experience, I had my mind blown and had to change my entire speech last night. So, I was going to tell you about the words FOB and ABCD, and I was going to tell you that I'm not confused, and this entire concept of Americanized Indians having no idea who they are was a load of garbage. My discussion with Ravi made me rethink all of it. So now, my opinion is as murky as ever, but I wanted to present it to you anyway, so that I can encourage you to think about these concepts from a much different angle than maybe you might have before. My angle was that someone saying somebody's fresh off the boat, we're defining their character as foolish for arriving from India, for dressing differently, for speaking with accents, or for allowing ourselves to believe the stereotype of the girls who go to temples on Fridays, or the boys who greet girls with handshakes instead of hugs. To me, FOB brings to mind imagery that sets people apart, as if our parents, or perhaps our very own selves, didn't step off the boat in the last few years. Likewise, the concept of an ABCD was irritating to me. I'm American raised, I'm also a Desi, but in my mind, minus a few questionable years in high school, I have never been confused. I told Ravi that. I'm not confused. I know more about culture than anybody I know. And he told me in his wise way to consider his experience. Of the many valuable points he brought out, three stick out. Firstly, the concept of FOBs. They're largely applied more to graduate students than they are to undergrads. Why? Like I mentioned before, wealth can often change the game with the collectivistic versus individualistic societies, right? Scholarships are tough to get. I'm sure that many of you will also leave college with more than a few dollars in a lender's pocket than you would like. That means that undergraduates from South Asia who attend universities in the United States are largely much wealthier because they are paying on their own dime. There are exceptions, of course, and that's definitely not a blanket statement by any means. But now consider the typical graduate student from South Asia. Academic, likely raised in their home country, and exactly what you picture when you say a FOB. Fresh off the boat because they've probably come directly from home, as opposed to having the means to live life with more exposure. Most of them earn their way through assistantships. That cross-cultural exposure before you land in the United States has a large role to play in the way you're perceived as a FOB or not. So now, even FOB can't universally be applied to those people coming from a different place. We've been stratified further. Then comes the ABCD. Many of us here grew up with traditional families, and college was the chance to unleash. Let's be real, there's been more than a few nights when my friends came home worse for the wear in college, and they were straight edge in high school. The image of an ABCD, for many, comes from that phase of freedom. The pendulum has swung from one extreme of traditionalism to the other, on the modernism side. But it isn't until after college and after growing up a little bit that the gong tends to settle somewhere in the middle. And even ABCD has been stretched to different levels. Someone growing up in the States versus someone who has ignored their South Asian roots is also comparable. Because let's be real, we've all seen the Indian kid who has no idea that he's from India. And we've also seen the kids who grew up here who are very, very traditional. So you never really know who you're looking at or what you're looking at and what their history actually involves. The second point that we discuss is the modernism of India versus the United States. I've heard from numerous 20-somethings who immigrated from India at older ages that they were shocked at how traditional we all seemed compared to their own upbringing, where we were taking Bharatanatyam classes, classical music lessons, learning to play the tabla and the veena, going to Indian history classes, and performing at Ras competitions like I did in college. Many who came directly from India hadn't participated in any of these activities. It wasn't a slight to how they were raised. They were just shocked that trends that seemed old-fashioned in India were activities that we took seriously here. Many were impressed and others thought that we were outdated. The third point came from my conversation with Ravi, followed by a conversation with a mutual friend named Rachna, who didn't know that she was in this speech. So, sorry. She grew up in Mumbai and just came here 6 weeks ago, although she's been back and forth in the last few years. Like I mentioned with the internet, the connectivity all over the globe is astounding. There's no traditionalism and modernism anymore because the entire context has shifted. The traditionalism used to mean a separation of the sexes until appropriate marriageable age, and a heavier influence of religion on day-to-day life, whether that was Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, Jainism, Sikhism, or anything else. More gender roles, and families that often stayed in the same area, and more coming and going of loved ones. Modernity meant the opposite. As Aishwarya Rai pointed on Oprah all those years ago, I don't have to take an appointment to meet my parents. Now, with schools that are co-ed, a decrease in religious activity for many of the people in our generation, a rapidly developing shift in gender roles, and families that are scattered across the globe, we can't apply the same rules anymore to what we view as correct and traditional or modern and presumptuous. Sometimes they mingle, sometimes they aren't so clear-cut. So now, we've discussed the growing up in the bubble, terminology, how they clash, and how we label each other. So now to the climax, which I can't say with a straight face anyway. So the scene of the story that brings the problem to its height. Funnily enough, I don't believe that the identity crisis is sorted out in college. I think it slowly unties its knot afterwards, when your life and your mind have stabilized and you kind of begin to work in tandem a little bit more. How did I learn that? By writing my book about the Indian girl who fell for the American guy. By going through it myself. By making a few of the wrong modern choices and some correct traditional ones. And by occasionally choosing my American side first and not giving into the pressure of society. Like the study by Trianda said, by letting myself be the individual in the collective and pushing back. I told you about how I graduated with degrees in science. Naturally, nursing was a potential career path, and it worked for me because I liked talking with patients as opposed to just treating them. I began at a reputable program, but after one semester I had enough. I was stressed, loving what I was learning, but not certain that it was the place for me. When I returned home, it felt like I failed. We'd thrown a party when I was moving away and announced in a grandiose fashion that I was pursuing a higher education, so really it felt more like I had let other people down. My parents insisted that it wasn't true, but they loved me, so their opinion didn't count. One of my favorite authors, the extraordinarily talented and gracious J.K. Rowling, once said, "Rock bottom became the solid foundation upon which I built my life." Like her, I believe that sometimes facing a challenge is what forces you to look up and reevaluate. During my time off, I began working again at a school that I'd been employed at previously. Then I was recruited into a master's program in early childhood special education. I took the opportunity thinking it was a good one to get my master's degree in something that I was good at. During the month before graduate school, I had a wave of inspiration. And I marched downstairs and I told my parents I was going to write a book. They looked at me like I had 3 heads, and then they finally nodded and said, "Okay, it's about time." It took me a month to write 160,000 words. For the record, that's over 400 Word document pages, single-spaced. I took a break on it while I was in school, finished my master's degree a year later, and then picked up the book again. At this point, I'd begun researching word counts and realized I'd written a very long piece of work that should probably be documented in the Library of Congress, and that wasn't very good. So I split it in half, polished the first half, and then began querying agents. Querying agents is this process where you look up agents online and see what their requirements are, and then email them a package containing a query letter, which is sort of like a cover letter, and it contains your pitch for your story. So you kind of have to read a little bit about advertising while you're at it. Then a synopsis, or a dry A to Z summary of your story from page 1 to the end, and then however many sample pages they request, which could be 5 pages, so they better be darn well written, or it could be 3 chapters. And then you wait. And then you wait some more. And if they happen to like what you've sent, they'll request the full manuscript. I began querying in October of 2013. I got a full request from my agent Stacy in January of 2014. I received a phone call from her in July, offering representation, by which time I'd convinced myself that she would never want it and I'd be doomed to a future as a failed writer, and then I'd rewritten the entire thing. So we went on submissions to editors a month later, and 3 months later, the second version of the book became the one that I was holding in my hands about 10 minutes ago. Throughout this journey, I feel compelled to say to the uncles and aunties that asked, I'm getting published, but I also have a master's degree in teaching. It felt like justification that I was indeed smart and this was just sort of a hobby, until I noticed that my best day of teaching paled in comparison to my worst day of writing. And that's when I decided to own it. I may have chosen both the uncommon routes in teaching preschoolers and also making an attempt at professional writing, but one fact always remains. The chances of getting an agent are less than 1 in 1 million. The chances of getting a publisher on your first book, even after getting an agent, is around 60%. So for a while, I liked to think that I was being an individual and making an autonomous decision. Soon it became pretty crystalline that it was an Annika thing. My success and drive came from being pushed as an Indian because we're constantly pushed in a world of competition. And my instinct to pursue the less traveled road was individual. It was both. I was the hyphen, and the hyphen does allow me to stand out. I met Cal Penn a few years ago, the guy from Harold and Kumar, and everybody nods because they all know, yeah. So he was campaigning for President Obama at Penn State, and we had a really long conversation in the middle of a garba. And he appealed to the tradition that night, and he brought up his family, who are Gujarati and Tamilian. Mindy Kaling is also Indian American, but she has mentioned in interviews that she wants to do her own thing and she wants to be successful at it. I commend that as much as I appreciate Cal Penn's approach to his family. Not only have they brought South Asians to the forefront of entertainment, they have changed the notion of what we must be into be who you are. I am Indian American. I am extremely traditional, and I am quite modern. I know who I am, but the clash is real. It exists. It can be painful, dividing, and lend itself to complications that other friends may not be able to relate to. It can lead to questions from aunties, like asking if I do a really good job at teaching preschool, if I'll ever get a promotion to teaching elementary school. That's not how it works, for the record. Yeah. And the occasional strange look when I talk about writing a love story about the Indian girl who broke the rules and fell for the American. It can lend itself to gossip, like whether the story was based on my life and all the whispers that you hear when you walk through a room. And it can also lead to regret if I hadn't written it at all. At the end of the day, this clash between traditionalism and modernism depends on me, and I will own that. So, you are at Vanderbilt University, and as I'm sure that you've heard a ton of times in speeches when you guys arrived here, You attend a school that includes amongst its alumni 2 vice presidents, 25 Rhodes Scholars, 7 Nobel laureates, Pulitzer Prize winners, and Academy Award winners. Like them, you have the opportunity to decide who you want to be and where you want to go. I'm not promising that it's going to be easy. Like I said, occasionally the ideals from our heritage and the aspirations from our future, they'll go to battle, and neither are going to back down until you force them to. But at the end of the day, there are a few suggestions that I have to give you in my wise old age of 28. Firstly, go into the world with empathy. As a writer, I am required to create characters out of nothing. I develop their motivations, their belief systems, their conversations, and their emotions. In order to successfully build people out of thin air and have invisible friends, you must first understand them, even if the road does not appear to be one that you would travel down. Before labeling a seemingly ancient tradition as outdated, give it some thought. Do some research. Talk to your parents or any other elders in your community who have insight. If anything, it'll turn into a learning experience, and it may give you some valuable camaraderie with family and friends who you believe are very different from you. My personal example is one that I mentioned earlier, that I haven't had a drink in my life. Penn State, when I first started, was ranked in the top 3 party schools in the country. We've made up our own nationally scrutinized and utterly ridiculous holiday entitled State Patty's Day, where, until stricter alcohol regulations kicked in, included a day of debauchery and green beer. I was convinced that my parents, who don't drink, were being silly when they told me time and again to abstain from it. I was sure that I would be the one dancing on the bar once I became a Nittany Lion. Then I was invited to my first frat party, and suddenly the desire to become a partier faded into the background as I heard my dad's voice. And suddenly I felt thousands of years of my family's history, and I had a sudden cognizance that I would be the one to end a streak of tradition if I chose to drink that night, and I have never looked back. Well, that's my own choice, and one that I believe everyone should make individually. That moment of hesitance where I gave my family some consideration was life-changing. I understood, as Albus Dumbledore once said, I'm a Harry Potter fan in case you can't tell, the greater good. I finally understood it. Understanding other people's opinions and thoughts can often strengthen your own convictions, and many times it can change them. I urge you to go into the world with daring. While we come from a beautiful history with rich tradition and rituals that are much older than the artifacts that historians even find, the future is still on its way and it still needs to be changed. Make choices for yourself. If there is a bucket list or a venture that you feel compelled to chase down, by all means, take the calculated risk and try it. While we should value our past and give it a second thought every once in a while, moving into the future often requires a leap of faith and decision to take your first step. As Gandhiji said, you may never know what results come of your action, but if you do nothing, there will be no result. That result, whether it is tradition and steeped in history, or modern and soaked in possibility, should be and can be one that only you decide. Thank you. Sorry. So, I would like to hear your thoughts first. I'm just really, really proud of myself right now that I didn't actually cough up my lung while I was speaking to you, so excuse the goofy grin. But what do you guys agree with that I've mentioned, and what do you guys disagree with? Have you guys had any experiences that you would like to share? Yeah, go ahead.